Welcome back to Auto Technic, and today's video is going to be a biggie. We're going to pick up where we left off in our last video. We just finished covering the tensioning of the timing belts and went in depth on all the different ways and procedures to do that. Today we're going to take on the second part of that task. I'm going to show you how to check and adjust the camshaft timing on this F355. Alright, so our timing belts are on, they're tensioned, we're good to go. Now we can start talking about our camshaft timing. So before we really get into it, I need to take you to the bench because this job requires a little bit more in the investment in the terms of special tools and just some setup. So I'm going to run you through some of the things that we're going to need. One of the main things you're going to need is a set of dial indicators here so we can measure the piston travel. This is a Hill Engineering kit, and it has these adapters that I will run in through the spark plug hole for cylinder number 1 and cylinder number 8 respectively. We have an extension for our dial indicator and our dial indicator. Now this all comes as a kit. They have other companies make similar tools like this. You could try to configure something without this kit, but this makes it very easy. I will say that for this purpose, a analog dial indicator is my preference, not a digital one. Now, speaking of dial indicators, we will need yet another dial indicator, and I prefer digital for the second one. And this dial indicator, I'll use these attachments here, and I made this base. So I just welded this little foot on so I can bolt this onto the cylinder head, and that's going to give me an attachment point for all of these so I can get this dial indicator set up. And we're going to be using this dial indicator right here to be measuring our lifter bucket travel, which is essentially going to tell us our camshaft travel. Now, we jump to the head, and you get a peek in there. You can see that you have very little and no access. We see just the corner of that lifter bucket down there. It's real tight. So a little trick is I have a piece of welding rod right here, and I've kind of just barely tapped the end of it so it threads into my dial indicator. I bent the foot at 90 degrees on it, and this makes it a lot easier to get this sitting down into the cylinder head, and a little bit more room to get this set up, especially when I'm working around this dial indicator, so that way I can be sure that my shaft for my dial indicator is not rubbing on the camshaft and it's still perpendicular to it. Once we get this set up, I'll show that in a little bit more detail. So we have that stuff, and this is all going to be attached up onto the cylinder head, and as I mentioned, we're going to need to know where the engine is at in terms of degrees. Now you can see I have several different degree wheels here because there's a little bit to talk about. Now, the factory has a special tool that we use at the dealership, and it went on the crank hub, or the front of the crankshaft in place of the crank hub. It threaded on, locked on tight, had our degree wheel, and basically big handles that we'd use to rotate the engine over with. And we had those for the Testarossas, 348s, 355s, so pretty much everything that had an engine out, we needed those. But on all of the 12-cylinder cars, so 456, all the derivatives of that, 550, 575, 612, and even the 360, we do all those timing belt services with the engine in the car, and there's no space for that tool. So the way to overcome that is, this is a spare crank pulley I have for this car, but I'm just using this for an example right now. But you can take these smaller, this is a Mr. Gasket degree wheel, and you can see that I've drilled the center hole out so that way a 36 millimeter socket, this isn't the socket. I have a chrome 36 millimeter socket that fits in there pretty much perfectly and helps center this tool, and that allows me to get a socket onto the crank bolt if this crank pulley is on the engine. But what we do is, you can see this hole pattern that's drilled around it, is I'll use this hardware on the bottom side, so just the bolt and the big washer, and you can catch the lip like that of your balancer and tighten that hardware down, and it helps hold this degree wheel in place. And I would just do it in 4 positions. The outside diameter of this degree wheel is larger than my hole pattern, so it doesn't match, but I think you kind of get the idea. So these degree wheels are pretty cheap. You can modify the center hole, modify your holes that go, and it's not super secure when you tighten these down, but you can tighten them down in the 4 locations, and it will hold the degree wheel in place. And then you can rotate the engine through the crank bolt, which is going to, obviously transfer all your force through this hub. And this is splined to the crankshaft, so you don't have to worry about your degree wheel moving, although you have it clamped on here, so you have to be careful not to bump it. It's not the greatest way, but it's cheap and it works. Although I generally don't like using the smaller degree wheels. You can see that I have just a different degree wheel here, and I prefer to use the largest degree wheel that I can possible. And this one I've never used on any Ferraris. This was my home degree wheel. This was my Ferrari degree wheel. Knowing that I'm willing to invest in tools, I came across a deal on this 355 crank pulley, and this thing was pretty beat when I got it, and I picked it up for like $100. So I was no brainer. Picked up that crank pulley, and you can see that I actually have drilled and tapped holes onto the face of it, and that allows me to take my bigger 16-inch degree wheel, and I can just bolt it onto my crank pulley. There's one thing I really don't like doing, and I try to avoid when putting a degree wheel on the engine, and that's taking the degree wheel and bolting it on through the center crank bolt, like this one right here, right there, and then tightening that crank bolt, and then using that crank bolt to rotate the engine. Because sometimes that crank bolt will tighten just a little bit, and it can take the degree wheel with it, and you could end up rotating your degree wheel like a couple degrees and not realize it, and then all your timing's out of whack. I don't like it. And I like to try to drive the crankshaft separate of the degree wheel. My thinking with this setup is I have this pulley. You can see it has a keyway. It's splined to the crankshaft. I can use the factory crank nut, so I'm twisting on the pulley with all my force to rotate the engine, but it's splined. So even if my nut moves, this pulley in relation to the crankshaft will not move. With my degree wheel bolted on, there's no way that my degree wheel is going to slip in relation to the crankshaft. It's essentially splined to it. The other advantage of this system is I'm able to use a short socket. I made a little bit of an adapter right there, and once the crank bolt is in, it actually holds everything nice and tight, and I have space around my drive for my ratchet, so that way all the force of my ratchet is going into the crank bolt to the pulley, not even touching the degree wheel. It holds all my tools in there, and it worked out pretty slick. The last thing that you're going to need is coat hanger, and you can see that I made some just pointers for my degree wheel. I'll show you that in a second once the degree wheel's on. Those you can make however you want, and you can mount them wherever you want. I will say that I keep all my old pointers, meaning from working on these cars enough when I go through all the services, rather than make new pointers every time I'm doing a timing belt service, I'll take those pointers when I'm done, I'll put some masking tape on them, and I'll mark them 355, set them aside, so then the next time I'm doing a 355, I have all my tools set up and ready to go. Alright, so we're just going to zip our bolt off and slide our bouncer or crank hub on. Now fortunately, these are not a tight press fit. They slide on and off quite easily. So slide that on there, and we're going to tighten it back down with our bolt. It doesn't really matter the torque, we're just hit it with our impact and that'll be good enough. And from there, I just use a shallow socket. It's what works good for this setup, and a spacer that I made for it. And actually, I'll kind of have to grab my degree wheel and my bolts for it. Where are the bolts for this guy? All right, got everything. So I do have the engine top dead center, cylinder number 1, and I do remember from when I set this up and drilled my holes that I have my degree wheel with my 0 degree mark sitting over here. See if we can't get all of this in there. Get it started without dropping everything. Obviously I have a little bit invested with my tooling for this setup and a little bit of time getting it positioned on the pulley so everything works together, but for as frequently as I'll be using this tool, it was an investment that was worth it for me. And once I figured everything out and get this set up, this will still be much quicker than the other method where I kind of clamp the degree wheel onto the pulley, that method I was talking about for the V12s and 360s. So I like this one quite a bit better, and I'll just hold the spacer in position and get this snugged down real quick. There we go. Now we're dialed. So you can see that the degree wheel is splined to the crankshaft, and you can see where my socket is, it's free and loose, meaning I'm not putting any force through this degree wheel. So the next thing that we need to take care of is our pointers. And you can configure these anywhere you want, and it's all relative, meaning you can put the degree wheel in any orientation that you want, and you make your pointers to match. So there's really no set way on making them. It's really a setup that works best for you. So I have 2 pointers, and well, I do this because this is a 90-degree V8. So if I set and calibrate one pointer here on my 0-degree mark, it saves me a little bit of time and hassle by setting my second one for bank 2 over here, and I'll just use this 90-degree mark. You'll see how that plays into itself when we're degreeing the camshafts in, because I don't have to reposition the degree wheel and set everything up. I just have to confirm my setting, meaning I'm going to set one pointer up here, calibrate it to my 0-degree mark, and then when I start, or I should say, I'll have my second pointer that I calibrate to this 90-degree mark over here. Once I move the bank 2, my 0 mark will be lined up on my new pointer. I'll show you guys when we get there. It's something that I started doing later in the years at the dealership because I found that it ultimately was just quicker. It saved me a little bit of time and hassle. I went through the setup once. I verify my setting when I go to use the second pointer, and just kind of have stuck with it. I have my alternator belt tensioner right here, and there's an upper mount, and I have this hardware loose because that's where I was using when I pulled this apart to check my timing, and that's the wrong pointer, this guy here. So I slide it over there, and you can see that my pointer is pretty close, and we're just going to eyeball it for now, and we'll fine-tune this here in a minute. Get it right on 0. And then for the bank 2 pointer, you can see back here I use a bottom screw for our tensioner, or stud. So it's right in between the belt. We'll take off that nut and this washer and slide our other pointer in. So using 2 pointers is not a necessity. I would imagine if you guys want to keep this simple when you're at home, you can just use 1, and then you would have to basically set this up twice. It's really a matter of preference. There's really no right or wrong way in this. I'm just showing you guys the way I like to do it. All right, so there's our second pointer on 90 degrees, our first pointer up here on 0 degrees. And that's all that we need to set up here. I'm gonna drop you guys in real quick, give you some good views of this, and then we're gonna shift our attention up onto the cylinder head. So with our degree wheel and everything on our crank, we're going to come up here and put on our tooling to measure the actual travel of the piston so we can establish top dead center. Now, everything says to have this set up at top dead center cylinder number 1, but if you recall back when we put the heads on, we're going over the crankshaft. Cylinder 4 happens to also be at top dead center. That piston moves in the exact same travel as cylinder 1. So if you're tight on space for whatever reason, it might be easier to put it back here to do your reading. I do that when I'm doing a 360 because the engine's in the car. It's easier for me to get that gauge up in there. Then I have more working space for my gauge up here to measure the cam. Some might say that it's not as precise because you're on a different crank throw, but I haven't had any issues with that method. But my preferred method, if I can, is to put it up here on cylinder 1. Now, back to what I said earlier about eliminating variables, you can see that I actually tightened this down with a wrench and got it pretty snug. Everything you can do. You could just put this in hand tight, but then if it starts to kind of loosen and wiggle on you, it can actually start throwing your numbers off and you'll start chasing your tail. Case in point, on this extension rod for our dial indicator, I've actually had those get loose on me where it left a couple threads right there. And then as I was working on trying to find top dead center, I actually had movement and inconsistent readings. And once I pulled the tool out, I found out that was the problem. So it's one of those things, you don't want those variables. Make sure it's nice and tight. And we're to slide this in and slide this gauge down on our brass bushing. We have an Allen here. Loosen this guy up. And we can make sure we're not bottoming out our gauge. We still have a lot of travel on this one. But I want this as deep as I can into my brass bushing. And from here, I know we're close to top dead center, so I want to try to get this in so the needle is going to rest vertically as much as possible. It just makes it a little bit easier for me to do my readings when I'm setting everything up. So right there, I'm good with that. So the actual depth doesn't really matter. We're not worrying about the second needle in this gauge. We're only worried about the larger needle. So we're going to tighten down our set screw, and there is one thing to keep in mind with this set screw here, is once you snug that down, we want to be sure our gauge isn't going to move, but we want to make sure that we're free on travel on this shaft, because you can see I have that screw just a hair too tight, and it's actually pinching my gauge. If I loosen this up some right there, it goes all the way down. So you want to be careful on how tight you tighten that screw. It's a fine line in between tight enough to hold the body of your gauge, but not to bind up your shaft. And we're pretty good right there. So, our gauge is in. We got our needle where we want it. We have our degree wheel on. I need to show you guys how we're going to calibrate this gauge and the arms on the degree wheel to establish true top dead center. And when we have it showing true top dead center, it's going to be showing it on our gauge and also our degree wheel, so in two positions. However, it's been a pretty long day, so I think I'm going to call it for tonight, and I'll see you guys back here tomorrow morning. All right, well, good morning to you guys. We're back out here, and first thing we need to take care of is we need to calibrate our dial gauge, measuring our piston travel to our degree wheel, and our little coat hanger pointers we have. Now, before we really jump into this, there's three things that we need to take into consideration when we're doing this. One of them is my own personal rule or philosophy. I do not rotate an engine counterclockwise, or I should say in the opposite direction of its normal rotation. Most engines are clockwise, so I don't go counterclockwise. And I do this for a few reasons. Now, some of the BMWs that I worked on, you could damage the oil pumps if you rotated the engine backwards. There is the possibility, like in the case of this with timing belts, that you could cause it to jump a tooth on your timing belt. Although these belts are so tight, that's unlikely. Essentially, you're running the risk of damaging something internally depending on the engine configuration. I'm not saying all engines are the same, but because of that fact, I just make it a general rule on any car I'm servicing. I don't do it. It's a no-go zone. With that being said, we're going to have to find top dead center with only rotating this engine clockwise. Now, that's a little tricky because we can measure our piston travel, but our piston travel is not the exact same as the travel of the crank throw. So if you think of the crank throw as an arm that's sweeping, when it sweeps all the way at the top, our rod has an area of dwell, meaning the piston itself is not really moving, but the crankshaft is moving. So the piston's going to go up, kind of sit stationary at top dead center, and then start coming down. It's very slight and gradual. Our dial indicator is going to pick up piston movement, but when it's not moving at dwell, it will not pick up that movement, although our crankshaft is still moving. So we need to find a way to calibrate that and account for the dwell, because I want to calibrate this gauge on my degree wheel precisely to the throw of the crankshaft, not necessarily the piston movement. The fidelity of our crankshaft is much greater than the piston movement. That's what we're looking for. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is our gauge that we have measuring our piston travel. There's a couple things to note on that. For one, it plugs into the spark plug hole, meaning when we rotate the engine out, we're going to start building compression on cylinder 1, just a slight amount. There is a notch in our brass bushing for the tools for some air to leak out, but as I rotate the engine over, you're going to hear it building some compression. That's important to note because on our compression stroke, we're going to build that compression, and it's actually going to push down on our piston and rod since we have no oil pressure in there and we have bearing clearance. That scale on that dial gauge reads in hundredths of a millimeter. So a lot of fidelity, very fine unit of measurement. My point being is, as I rotate this engine over, if I were to rotate the crankshaft 1 revolution, the piston's still going to be at top dead center, but depending if it's on compression or not, we're going to see a difference on our gauge. So when we rotate this engine over to calibrate the gauge, we're going to be chasing our tail if we rotate it 1 revolution each time. So we need to rotate the engine 2 revolutions each time to be sure that we're putting the engine back in the same state, which would be on the compression stroke, to calibrate our gauge for the process. Pay attention as I'm rotating it through. You'll see the numbers on the gauge. The needle's going to land differently depending if it's on a compression stroke or not, even after everything's calibrated. Now, it's probably worth noting that my method of calibrating this and getting everything zeroed in and the scale of measurement that I'm, the fidelity that I'm getting everything calibrated to is, I'm pretty certain it's over the top. Probably not necessarily to take it this precise, but this is just the procedure that I've done. This procedure I use on all of the engines, no matter if it's a V8 or V12. It works for me. The numbers are the same. I've had good results with it, so I've just stuck with it over the years. I did my best to give you guys some good views at the cameras, so I'm going to try my best to work around it and not block it. But we have the engine set, top dead center, compression, cylinder 1. You can see that I've taken my pointer and I have it as closely calibrated to 0, and we're doing our second one over here at 90, on the 90-degree mark as I can have it. You can also see on my gauge up here that I have it pretty much right on 0. So you might be wondering, how are we going to determine the dwell of the piston without rotating the engine backwards? Because the most conventional way to do so is actually using a physical piston stop, rotating the engine till the piston stops, and you would mark your degree on the degree wheel. You rotate it the other direction till the piston stops again, mark your degree on the degree wheel. Then you take those two numbers, split them in half, and that's your true top dead center of your crank arm. We don't have the ability to do that, so we're going to use the piston travel and kind of do the same thing. So I have the piston at its dwell, and we're going to measure how far the piston is falling down at a set measurement, and then we're going to take note of our degrees on the degree wheel, and we're going to use that method to get this zeroed in and everything calibrated. Everything's set on 0. We're going to rotate it over 2 revolutions so we get back on top dead center compression, although we're going to stop a little shy before we come up to full top dead center on our degree wheel. So you can hear it starting to compress in cylinder 1 now as we're coming up on our intake. And we're getting close, about 15 degrees. I'm going to stop. You can see my dial indicator has picked up the piston. Now, the numbers I'm going to give you are numbers that I've used through the years, and again, it's on every Ferrari engine. I've used the same numbers. We're going to watch for 0.5 millimeter of piston travel. That's the number we want. So it's going to be 0.5 millimeter below top dead center. At 0.5 millimeter below top dead center, I should be at roughly 8.5 degrees on the degree wheel. Now, our piston's coming up through our travel. So let me get in here and see if I can get an accurate look. I'm watching my degree wheel. I'm up at 9 and I'm stopping right at 8.5. All right, so I'm at 8.5, and you can see that I'm a 57, 56. So we're definitely off. We're going to carry this up to top dead center to see where we're at. I'm reading 0 here, and you can see now my gauge is off. So I'm going to zero that back to 0. We're at top dead center there. We're going to do the same as the piston's going down. I'm going to target 0.5 millimeter of piston travel and see where a degree wheel ends up. And it should be 8.5 degrees. Right there. And we're right at 8 degrees. So you can see, even though our gauge was reading 0 at top dead center compression, our degree wheel is still a bit off because we want to see that 8.5 millimeters. Essentially, the number you see on your degree wheel doesn't matter. You want to see the same number on the upstroke and downstroke of the piston, and also the 0.5 millimeter on this gauge. It doesn't matter. You just want to see the same number. I use 0.5 millimeter because it's easy. It's easy to see on the gauge. It's half of a revolution, and I also know that it comes to 8.5 on the degree wheel. You could pick a different number on here, and it's going to correlate to a different number here. It's going to be the same method. We're going to measure where the piston is at a set point on its upstroke and measure it on its downstroke. And our degree on our degree wheel needs to equalize. So you'll also see that we're going to zero this gauge in at the same time we're zeroing in our dial indicators. So it's kind of like as we get closer with each one, we'll bring it into the fully calibrated state. We're going to rotate it over. 2 more revolutions. And okay, we're at 15 before top dead center, so we're going to go much slower. And I usually know that once I watch about 10 degrees, I switch my eyes up to my dial indicator. This time we're going to take the dial indicator to 0.5 millimeter, which is 50 on that gauge. I'm going to stop it right there, and I'm reading 9 degrees on my degree wheel. So now I switch my eyes back up to my dial gauge. We're going to take it up the top dead center. We're about to hit it with our needle. It's a little bit before top dead center there. And I'm showing about 1 degree on the degree wheel. So you can see that gauge isn't moving anymore, so it's on its dwell. So we're just going to move that back a little bit. And we're at 0 degrees, so it's starting to drop. Now we're watching the dial indicator down to 50. Right there. And we're at 8 degrees on this one. So we need to keep doing this because each time I make an adjustment, it's going to change the reading on the degree wheel. So I readjusted the 0 point of the dial indicator. So 2 revolutions around again. We're at 10. Take it. Oh, overshot it. So we got to go all the way around 2 more times. All right. So we're right about 10. I'm going to watch for 50 on my gauge. Right about there. And we're showing 9 on my pointer. So we're going to continue watching our gauge because we want to see the dwell on our dial gauge coming up. And you'll see it starts to stop right about there. Right on 0, it's dwelling. I'm slowly moving the crank and it's starting to fall down. So I'm showing 0 degrees and the piston's starting to fall down. So what this is telling me is I've had a consistent reading for 2 revolutions on the dial gauge. So that's pretty much dialed into the travel of the piston, although my pointer is not calibrated yet. So we're going to focus our attention to the pointer. So back to what I said, we're going to take our dial gauge and bring this to 50 right there. And we're going to look, and I'm still at 8. So I was telling you guys that we need the same number, and if you remember, I'm at 9 on this side, so it was 9 degrees before top dead center where I was reading the same piston travel, and I'm 8 degrees after, which tells me I'm 1 degree off on my pointer, which also matches where my pointer was pointing at in terms of 0 on top dead center. So we're going to split the difference and move this pointer approximately to the 8.5 degree mark, and just give it a little bend. I like my pointer to be as close to the wheel as possible, but not touching. So I got to keep a little pressure on the crank. You can see I let off on the ratchet and it walked back on me a little bit. All right, that's about 8.5, so let's try it again. So we're going to go 2 revolutions. And we're coming up 10 degrees before top dead center. So now I switch my eyes to my dial gauge. We're targeting the stop right at 50. And if we look, we're at 8.5 degrees before top dead center. So we're going to rotate this over, and I'm going to bounce back and forth watching where my 0 degree mark is in relation to my dial gauge. They should be pretty accurate, where I should be hitting 0 right about there, rolling up on 0 degrees. So this gauge should be on dwell and not moving, and the crankshaft drops down. Come back to our dial gauge, stop at 50. Right there, and you can see we're right about at 8.5 degrees on the crankshaft. So I mentioned it earlier, the degree you pick on the crankshaft, it's arbitrary. We could do this with 1 millimeter of piston travel down, and it's just going to change the number we're watching for here. Another thing to note is my second pointer that I put on here. Now that I've calibrated this pointer, I can set my degree wheel top dead center cylinder 1 compression. Coming right up on it here. So we can get that set right there. And if you look here, we're a degree off on my 90 degree for bank 2. So since we're here, I'm going to make that adjustment and get that set right there on 90 degrees. Now, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but when I come to degree this side of the engine, I will move my dial indicator over here for this cylinder 8 piston for top dead center. But this is going to save me a lot of time on getting everything calibrated, because as long as I don't hit it and bump it, if I rotate this 90 degrees, right there, that's top dead center cylinder number 8 on this side. So we're going to have to set this pointer up anyways. By doing it now and calibrating it with that other pointer, it just saves a little bit of setup time. It makes it a little bit easier. So now we have our degree wheel calibrated and set, so we know where true top dead center is on the crankshaft. We're not going to rely too much on our piston travel gauge up into the cylinder. We're going to be using our other dial indicator to watch the camshaft travel. However, I do leave that up there while I'm working on everything, just to keep an eye on things, make sure nothing moved, and it's an extra redundant way to know what's going on. As you can see, when I'm rotating the crankshaft over with that dial gauge, that really gives you a good example of where you can see that piston dwelling and where we want to kind of narrow it down to the crankshaft. Because we watched our piston dwell on the gauge and had it zeroed, but we are still a degree off on our crankshaft. So that means that little extra work, we narrowed it down, because our tolerance for proper camshaft timing comes down to plus or minus 1 degree. Meaning that could have had our camshaft timing out. Say we had our we set our intake cam that was 1 degree out of spec, not realizing we were a degree out on the crankshaft, we'd be 2 degrees out on our timing. So from watching our piston travel gauge move, you can see why I prefer the analog style gauge. I find it a lot easier to be able to watch the needle revolve around the face of the gauge, why I'm doing this rather than focusing on numbers. It's just an easier visual, it gives me a better idea of what's actually going on. So that is the sole purpose of why I prefer that style gauge. I'm going to take a minute and get my tooling set up on the intake camshaft so we can start degreeing them in. I'll bring you guys back and show you how the tooling's all set up. Alright guys, so we're taking a quick break from this 355, and that's because I have a favor to ask of you. What I'm asking is for you guys to jump in the comment section right now, drop in a comment, ask a question of what we're doing. I'm going to be in there responding so we can have some good dialogue. However, there's another twist to it. I want you guys to put what city or state or even country you're viewing the video from. I want to see how far this video is getting out there. Now, as for myself, I'm located in the Seattle, Washington area, the Great Pacific Northwest. So drop in where you're from, get the comment section going. Let's get back to the 355. All right, so here's my tooling set up to measure the intake camshaft. You can see that I took my little adapter that I built years ago, and it's bolted on to the stud for the valve cover, and that gives me a solid base to mount the rest of my configuration on to have my dial indicator positioned. Now, important thing to note, if you're going to build a tool or use something like this, be cognizant of your cam lobes when these rotate around. If this is too wide, it's going to hit those cam lobes, cause issues. Ask me how I know. That's not the first version of the tool that I made. Now, you kind of have to eyeball from the positioning of the valve, and you can see from the lifter bucket and the head, the angle that you set that gauge at. You want that gauge set as closely as you can to match the same plane of the valve. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just the best guess. You can see enough of that lifter bucket sticking up. If you pull the tape, since I have the throttle bodies off, you can see the stem of the valve. You can kind of get a rough idea. But spend a little bit of time, get that where you think it's straight and true. And that's one little advantage that I have with this foot that I made, that it's still down there measuring the travel of the lifter. And get the light in here. And you can see it is down there, so we have to avoid the cam lobe and also kind of avoid the base of the camshaft. So you can see that foot down there is kind of wrapped underneath the camshaft on top of the lifter. And I've ran the engine through its cycle. I made sure that that shaft doesn't interfere on the base circle of the cam lobe. I make sure that it's not getting trapped under the lobe, because sometimes that can happen. And made sure that my dial indicator is set so I have full range of travel on that dial indicator. So we're good there, and there's really no special calibrating procedure that we need to do right now on that gauge. We will zero that out when we get to the right point. We have all of our tooling set up, all of our instrumentation, so we can measure everything. I've got cameras configured all over the place here for you guys, so hopefully I can capture this well for you at home. So with that, let's get into it. All right, so I think most of us that have degreed a camshaft before, we're probably familiar with the process where we're gonna say like the intake centerline method, where you measure the center point of the intake cam lobe, and that's where you use to degree your camshaft in, or you can measure it based on your opening or closing events of the camshaft. I will warn you that Ferrari does give us our timing events on this engine. However, the workshop manual, the procedure and numbers it gives us to degree the camshafts in, essentially are just arbitrary numbers. It's kind of bizarre because they don't go off of an intake centerline method, and the numbers they give us, I don't know how they came up with it and chose it. It changes from engine to engine, but it's what we have. So I'll walk you through that procedure. The other thing to note, this engine is a hydraulic lifter engine. So some people may kind of get it in their head that they're wondering what the, if you have a little bit of oil leakage in your hydraulic lifter, that's moving and the valve travel is not consistent. None of that matters because we're measuring the top side of the lifter bucket, and that will only be moved by the camshaft. So although our valve travel may be different since there's no oil pressure, it doesn't matter because we're just using the lifter bucket to understand what the camshaft is doing in relation to the crankshaft. Oh, one more thing. I did not cover this. You cannot set your tooling up on the center cam lobe on the intake side. That camshaft lobe is retarded 10 degrees in relation to the outer lobes for the camshaft. So I have mine tooled up on the front lobe. That's only because it was easiest to do so with my tooling. Just note to yourself, stay off the center lobe. Your numbers will be, effectively, if you degree your cam in off that lobe, you're going to be 10 degrees out. So center lobe, ignore them. We're going to run you through what the workshop manual says for degreeing the camshafts. It's saying to position a comparator, dial indicator, with a feeler on the bowl of the intake side valve of cylinder number 1. It does make a note not to set it on the center valve because of the retardation of 10 degrees. It says to set my dial indicator to 0 and rotate the crankshaft in its direction of rotation. I'll read this exactly for you. It says set to 0 and rotate the driving shaft in its direction of rotation as long as the cam axle causes the comparator pointer movement of 2.41 millimeters. In this conditions, the geonometer degree wheel should be on 0 of top dead center. When this occurs, the foreseen intake valve opening advance of 16 degrees will happen. Yeah, that is about clear as mud. That's a pretty poor way to explain it, and I think a lot of the problem is these manuals are translated so literally, and if you actually, like someone that can read Italian reads the Italian section, it makes much more sense than the English version that's been translated from that. I had made a cheat sheet for myself years ago. Let's see if I can pull this up. Here we go. So for camshaft timing, these are my own notes. So once I wrapped my mind around this process, I wrote my own notes and my own words so I can understand this process. It's basically saying when you set the engine the top dead center on compression, cylinder number 1, 0 out my dial indicator, this guy. Then I'm going to rotate the, getting ahead of myself. When we're at top dead center, cylinder number 1 compression, as we're pretty close to it right now, you can see my cam lobes are up, so I have no travel on my lifter bucket. My lifter bucket is all the way up, my valve is closed, so that's where we're going to 0 out our dial indicator. Then we're going to rotate the crankshaft to top dead center overlap. So on top dead center overlap, we're going to be having valve travel, and we're looking to have 2.41 millimeters on that gauge at top dead center overlap. That's our cam timing. There is a chart in the workshop manual that shows you if you have a different reading from 2.41 millimeters on what your degreeing is or your degrees on the crankshaft is, but I generally don't rely on that because there's just an easier way in my opinion. We'll come back to our engine. So we'll bring this around. Top dead center compression. So we're on top dead center compression, and now we need to 0 out our dial indicator here. And we have this reading in millimeter because that's what the workshop manual calls out. From here, now that we've 0'd that out and we have no lift on our intake cam, we're going to rotate the engine 1 revolution, the top dead center compression, and take our reading on this dial indicator. So we'll rotate this around, and I'm watching the degree wheel, not the piston travel. And it's going to start giving me some intake lift, which is a negative number, which is fine. We're coming up on 10, 0. So I'm going slow now, watching my dial indicator. I'm at 2.3, 2.3, 3.7, 3.8, 3.4, 4.1. So that my cam lobe is exactly where it needs to be. If we look at our degree wheel, we're 1 degree off. So it's 1 degree before top dead center, meaning my camshaft's 1 degree advanced. So I'm fortunate and also unlucky here on the intake camshaft. We're 1 degree off from where we need to be on our camshaft timing, which puts me in my tolerance, which we're plus or minus 1 degree or plus or minus 1 crankshaft degree on where the camshaft timing should be. So I don't need to make any changes on this intake side. Now that aligns with my measurements that I had pre-service because I measured everything, or I checked everything, and they were in spec. I marked all my cam gears, got everything back together. Granted, we did have the heads milled a little bit, but that doesn't seem to have affected this particular camshaft. But that tells me that I got everything back the way it was, and everything is good on this intake camshaft. So, for now, I'm going to rotate the engine a few more times, confirm that my gauge up here zeroes out as it should, confirm that I get the same reading. I'm not going to rely on just one reading. Typically, I need 3 consistent readings to convince myself that yes, I do have a true reading. So we need to bring it back, the top dead center on compression, and my dial indicator is reading 0 as it should, and I'm still reading 0 on my camshaft. So we'll sweep this back around, the top dead center overlap, and we should come back with the same 1 degree before top dead center. And I'm watching my dial indicator now, not the degree wheel. Coming up on it. 2.3, 2.4, 2.41. Ah, I moved it. It was a degree, almost a degree and a half it looked like on that one. So bring it back around. And at any time, if we're questioning the relation of that degree to our pointers, we can always do the same thing we did to calibrate it, which is rotate our crankshaft down to the 0.5 millimeter apart and make sure we're at 8.5 degrees. So that's one of the reasons why I leave the piston travel gauge in. It gives me a good kind of sanity check if I so choose. So we'll bring this back around on overlap. Watching my dial indicator up here. That's right at 1 degree. So we'll give it one more good revolution. We get another number, we'll trust it and jump over to the exhaust. Watching my dial gauge coming up, 2.3, 3.1, 4. That's right at 1 degree. So we can take this and we'll rotate it over to the full 0 mark. Watching the degree wheel. We're at the 0 mark, and that's saying 2.53 is our travel of our camshaft. Jump over to the chart in the workshop manual, and it's saying 2.5 is 17 degrees before top dead center of the intake camshaft opening, which matches the 1 degree on our degree wheel, which is what I was talking about earlier. You don't necessarily need that chart because we are looking at the degree wheel, and according to the workshop manual, it says for us to rotate the engine over, stop it on top dead center overlap at 0 degrees, and then read our dial indicator. We would take that number and use the chart to figure out how far off we are. I kind of reverse what we're looking at. If I watch my dial indicator and I wait for the number that we're looking for, our target number, which is 2.41 millimeters, and I stop cranking the engine at 2.41 on this, I can look at the degree wheel and just see how far away I am from 0 degrees. So that's an easier method for me because I don't have to jump back to the workshop manual, keep referencing it, coming back to the engine. I can just look at the degree wheel. All I need to do is memorize the number I'm looking for on this indicator, and we're set. So with that, let me get everything set up on the exhaust side and see how that one shapes out. All right, we've got our tooling switched over to the exhaust side. Now with just the 2 cam lobes on the exhaust side, we don't have to worry about the 3rd center lobe and any retardation. You can put your tooling on either lobe. Now that we ran through this procedure for the intake side, guess what? they changed it for the exhaust side. I mean, why not? So, again, I'm going to read you what it says in the workshop manual, and I'm doing this to kind of highlight how vague and poorly described it is. So it says, follow the above specified instructions and reposition the comparator by setting it to 0 while the feeler gauge is on the bowl of the exhaust valve with cylinder number 1. Move the tooling, we've done that. Rotate the driving shaft until the exhaust cam axle performs a closing phase. At the closing end, the valve comparator should be on 2.29 millimeters, thus having the exhaust valve closing retardation of 16 degrees. Yep, pretty vague, right? Here's the notes that I've wrote for myself on the exhaust cam timing. Exhaust cam, put the engine on top dead center of overlap, 0 out our dial indicator. Rotate the engine until there is no lift left in the valve. I should have 2.29 millimeters on my dial indicator. So on this one, it doesn't matter on the degree wheel where we end up because we're watching the closing of the exhaust valve. And essentially is what it wants us to do is at top dead center overlap, we're going to 0 that dial gauge. And that means there should only be 2.29 millimeters of lifter travel left. So I'll show you how all that works out. Set this guy down. All right. We need top dead center overlap, which we are already on. So with that, 0 out our gauge. All right, so we're on top dead center overlap. Our gauge is 0'd out. I should just be able to rotate this. And you can see that my valve travel has stopped. It doesn't matter the degrees. It moved a little. You see we're stuck at 2.35 and we're there. So we're shooting for 2.29, not 2.35. So again, rather than using a chart that's in the manual, I'll show you how I determine where we're at. Essentially, we came up on, we're now at 2.37. It's changing a little on us. Let's bring it back to top dead center and be sure that it zeroes out. Okay, we're coming up top dead center, right there, and we're at 0. So we'll do one more check. 2.33, and I can see that my lobe is clearly off the lifter bucket. So I'm not going to worry about that gauge changing its numbers as I continue to rotate the engine because we've effectively moved it just to get the lobe off the valve. So we have 2.33 of a millimeter now, and we want 2.29, so we're 0.04 of a millimeter off. So how do we figure out easily how that translates in the crankshaft degrees? So I'm going to bring it back to top dead center overlap, but before I get to 0, we're going to go back and look at our dial gauge. So you can see that we have movement. We're starting to close our valve. We're coming up on it, so it's 0.83. So now that we're this close, remember it's 0.04 of a millimeter that we're off from the spec. So I'm going to rotate the crankshaft watching my gauge, stopping at 0.04 millimeter. Getting close. .04 millimeter right there, which has me pretty much on 0, maybe a half degree off. By doing it this method, technically I should be at 0, but if I was like a degree off, if I stopped at if I had a bigger number, it's going to show that I'm a degree off basically. So we could probably go and 0 this, and we'll rotate it again in 2.33. So we're back to the 0.04. So we're getting a consistent reading. When I bring it back and try to stop, I think this one's so close to being on spec also, it's not going to show us what I'm trying to show you on this degree wheel here. So we'll try it again. We'll bring it up to 0.04. Yeah, it's so close it's not going to work right there. And we're pretty much at 0 degrees, so it's not going to work. That's just doing hypothetical to show you how this works. We have this essentially zeroed out here. We'll get a 0. We're going to rotate that, and we got the same thing, 2.33. So let's exaggerate this and say we're at 2.43 millimeters, so we're 0.14 millimeters off on our lift. We're just pretending here. So if that was our number, we're going to rotate this around, and I'm going to watch my dial gauge as I'm bringing it back up to top dead center overlap, and I want to stop on the 0.14 millimeters. So I want to take the difference of the measurement that I had and the spec and stop on that number, and that will tell me how many degrees off I am. So we're watching our dial gauge. We're coming up 1.6, so we're looking for 1.4. And we're almost there, 1.4. And you can see right there, the 1.4 is 1 degree off. So we're at 1 degree before top dead center here. So that's how I can determine with what number I have, how many degrees off I am, and that tells me if I'm within spec or not. Or we can just jump to the workshop manual and use that spec. Again, both of those cams are dialed in, so that's good for me. That's less work. However, I really wanted to show you guys the procedure to get them dialed in. So we're going to jump over to bank 2, go back through this procedure, and we're going to see if we can find one of these camshafts out of spec, so that way I can actually run you through the procedure. So hang tight with me. I'm going to get everything moved and set up, and we'll continue on. All right, everything's moved over here to bank 2. We're going to start by just verifying that our pointer to our piston travel is all calibrated correctly. So set that at 0. And we're going to just start. We're over here on... We're on overlap, it looks like. So let's bring it over the top dead center compression. Top dead center compression right there. And let's get our dial gauge set to 0. Now we're going to start from here. Since I already ran you through the procedure of how we calibrate this, we're just going to rotate this, watch our gauge, stop at 0.5 millimeter. Right there. And we're right at about 8.5. So let's bring it around and check before top dead center. Again, always checking on the compression stroke. Because if we watch, I'll bring it up on top dead center on the power stroke. You can see that my needle's not dead set on 0. And bring it up on compression. We'll slow down before we get the 10 degrees before top dead center. Watching our dial gauge, going to 0.5 millimeter. Back to our degree wheel, and we're right about 8.5. So we know that our pointer's still calibrated. And we'll bring this back to 0, and our dial indicator should land right about on 0, right there. So we're good. We're set, and everything was calibrated, confirmed to be where it needs to be when we set it up based on bank 1, which is good information. So now, to set our cam timing, we need to be on top dead center compression, which is where we're at. 0 out our dial indicator here. It's always tricky to get a perfect 0 because our hand moves it. So we're zeroed out. So if you remember on the intake side, we need to rotate the engine, top dead center overlap. We're looking for 2.41 millimeters. So we'll bring the engine around. And I'm watching the degree wheel. We're just going to bring it to 0. Right there. And we're at 1.33. Why are we wildly off? Well, that's why we're at 1.3 millimeters. So I just checked, and I don't have this set deep enough. It's bottomed out on its movement, and my finger there is no longer touching the lobe of the bucket, or I should not say the lobe, but the lifter bucket. So I need to lower that down, and we need to start over. All right, so we're set, top dead center compression. We got our gauge zeroed out. Now it's important to note that top dead center compression, all of our valves are closed, so the camshaft, you can see our lobes are pointing up, away from the lifter bucket. So the actual degree that we're at isn't as critical right now on zeroing this gauge, because we theoretically can move the crankshaft a little bit, and it's having no effect on our lifter right now. It's in the closed position. We're going to take it the top dead center overlap, and we're looking for that 2.41 millimeters of camshaft travel. So we're getting close. We're at 1, 2, 3, 1, 4. So I'm watching my dial gauge up here on the lifter bucket, and I'm going to stop at 2.41, just like we did on the other side. 3.8, 3.9, 4, 4.1 right there. And we are, there we go, we're a degree and a half off, 4.4. So my degree wheel was about a degree and a half off. If we take this all the way up to 0, we're at 2.58. So let's do this a couple more times to be sure that we have an accurate measurement. Top dead center compression, we're zeroed out. We'll bring this up, coming close to 10. Back to our dial gauge, we're watching, looking for 2.41. Going slow. Getting close, 3.5, 3.9, 4, 4.1. So from what I see right here, we are about a degree and a half off on our camshaft timing. Let's do this one more time to confirm. Watching my dial gauge, looking for a 241. Right there. Yeah, that right there looks like 2 degrees off. So our tolerance is plus or minus 1 degree. We'll take this all the way over to 0. And that's showing 262. Let me go look at my chart in the workshop manual. See if that matches the 2 degrees off. All right. So in the workshop manual, it gives us a spec of 2.63, which happens to be pretty much dead on. We're at 262, and it matches. It's 2 degrees off. So this camshaft is 2 degrees out of time. We have a tolerance of 1 degree, plus or minus the desired degree. So what I think I'm going to do now is take you guys to the bench, and we need to talk about the correlation of the cogs on the teeth of this cam gear in relation to the dowel holes on the cam gear in relation to the camshaft. I need to really explain that in real detail at this point, so that way we know what we need to do in order to get our cam timing in spec and how we're going to adjust this. Okay, so I'm a very visual learner. Visual aids really help me understand what's going on. So I'm going to utilize that to try to explain to you guys how these cam gears work. This is a copy of the diagram that's in the workshop manual, and this is representing the camshaft. This is representing the cam gear. Now there's a lot of numbers on this one page, so it gets pretty confusing. So I spent a little bit of time and edited off half of the numbers, so we'll start on this page. Let's start talking about the camshaft here. So we have holes that almost go all the way around the camshaft. We're missing 2 here. Why, I don't really know, but it is important because sometimes that will get us a limitation on degreeing in our camshafts. But if we look at this chart, we got the center point of the camshaft here, and each line that we have intersecting each and every hole where the dowel pin goes, and this is indicating 22 degrees and 30 minutes. If you guys know 22 degrees 30 minutes, that's 22 and a half degrees. So there's 60 minutes in a degree, 30 minutes is half of that. So from here on out, I'm going to refer to that as 22 and a half degrees. That's pretty straightforward. That means with each movement of our dowel pin, we're going to change our camshaft timing by 22 and a half degrees. Now let's go over to our camshaft gear. We have holes 360 degrees around, which is nice. That makes it easier. And the spacing on these holes is 24 degrees. So I'll come back to this sheet. The best way to explain it is I highlighted all those holes so you can see the color, and I cut out what would be a camshaft gear so we can overlay them. And I'll kind of get this lined up. I'm lining up the center hole right up there by my finger. And if you get that lined up, you can see how all the holes get offset over here. So when we have this configured in the car, let's say the center hole, that's where our dowel pin is. When we move our dowel pin to make a camshaft change, we'll take it out of that hole, move it into this hole in the cam gear, but it's also going to be now in this hole in the camshaft, not this hole. So as what we're doing is we're moving that dowel pin 24 degrees on our cam gear and 22 and a half degrees on our camshaft. That's effectively 1.5 degrees that we moved our camshaft. Now, everything we're talking about here, it's important to note, we're talking camshaft degrees. Everything when we're on the engine, I'm talking in crankshaft degrees. Our timing specs are in crankshaft degrees. Our camshaft revolves half the speed of the crankshaft, so with each movement of the dowel pin, that's effectively 3 degrees of crankshaft movement. Now, I will say that there is some slop in the dowel pin, the cam gears, and the camshaft, so sometimes you can get closer to 4 degrees, and sometimes you can kind of rock the camshaft in there on that dowel pin and get a little bit of room. But 3 degrees, mathematically, with what Ferrari's telling us, that's our movement. So we don't move the dowel pin from a hole in the cam gear to a separate hole and then keep it in the same hole in the camshaft, because then that's going to move our timing like 20 degrees, wildly out. Again, I said I'm a visual learner, I'm a visual guy, so here's the best way I can correlate this. You can see that we're 2 degrees before top dead center over here. We're measuring our remaining lift on our cam lobe, and I stopped at the 2.42. It's supposed to be at 2.41, meaning at this, the camshaft's at the correct location, but we're not yet to the correct location on the crankshaft. So I know that if I rotate this crankshaft more, my camshaft is going to continue giving the valve lift. So we're going to have too much lift here at the valve. So me being visual, remember, these spin counterclockwise. Me being visual, knowing that if I push down on the crankshaft, my 2 degrees, I'm going to push my camshaft in more. So I know that that's going to be too much. So visually, I know that I need to take my cam lobes and pull them away from the lifter buckets. So my camshaft needs to rotate clockwise in order to get my cam timing right. So I hope I can show you guys with some light in here. It's really tricky with a glare, but you can see the holes for that dowel pin, and the one directly on either side of the dowel pin, it looks like those holes line up. Right there is actually a really good shot. If you look at the hole directly above my dowel pin, you can see just a shadow of the camshaft where it overhangs, and you can see that if I rotate that camshaft clockwise, that will line up and allow me to put my dowel pin in. So I know that I need to rotate my camshaft clockwise, move my dowel pin up 1 hole, and that should give me 3 degrees of movement. I'm going to set you guys down, and then we're going to make that move, recheck our timing, and see how it affected it. All right, we got our bolt out, so I have a pair of just old pair of pliers that I ground down, and these usually allow me to get in here and get a decent bite on that dowel pin. Now, because the timing belt's so tight, it does tend to pull in the cam gear, which can make it hard to get the dowel pin out. But in this case, it slid out pretty easily. So you can see all of our marks that we had everything lined up. And if you remember, I want to bring the camshaft back my direction, so I'm going to move this dowel pin up 1 hole. And you can see that it's not going to go in all the way. So I will then set the dowel pin here. I set my 27mm wrench on the camshaft and very carefully rotate the camshaft clockwise right there. And you can see that I barely moved that camshaft. My dowel pin is now in a new hole on the cam gear and on the camshaft. So that gave me the 1.5 degrees of movement up here on the cam gear, which should translate down to the 3 degrees on the crankshaft. So let's get our bolt back in, and we're going to run back through our cam timing check and see how this ended up for us. All right, so we made our move on our dowel pin on our cam gear. So we're going to rotate this back over and re-zero our gauge and see what we ended up with. So we'll bring it back, top dead center compression. Right there, top dead center. See if we can't get that fully zeroed out. And we'll take it the top dead center overlap. 6.5. So again, we're looking for 2.41 on this dial gauge. 2.3, 2.34, 2.41. And that's now showing 2 degrees after top dead center. So that's about a movement of 4 degrees. we need to narrow down our scope of adjustment, right? We had it beforehand, it was showing 2 degrees before top dead center on our degree wheel. We made a move on the dowel pin, now we move it the other way, and it's showing about 2 degrees after top dead center. When we're moving those dowel pins, each time we're making an adjustment, we're moving it from one hole in the gear and the camshaft 3 degrees. Now our spec is plus or minus 1 degree. 3 degree movement, it's a pretty broad range. Well, there's more adjustability in the system. So that brings me back to this original picture that I showed you with the second set of numbers. So we're going to jump to this sheet where I reversed the work and eliminated the other numbers. We're back talking about the camshaft gear. Now let's pay attention to these lines because they're intersecting the center point of each tooth on the camshaft gear. Look at those lines in relation to our dowel pins, and you can see that this one is on the, third of the right hand side. This line is pretty much on the exact edge, and then this line's even closer to the right hand side of the dowel pin. Each one of these is 11 degrees, 15 minutes, so 11 1/4 degrees. Essentially, is what this is referring to is the relation of these teeth to these holes. And by moving this cam gear on our timing belt, we can change the degree range of these dowel pins. And since that's 11 1/4 degrees and our other movement that we're doing is 22 1/2, that's basically half of that. So this essentially is going to break us down to 1.5 degrees at the crankshaft of movement. We achieve that by taking the timing belt off, taking the cam gear off, and moving it. Now, one thing to note, let's say this is where we have the dowel pin right now on this line, and if we moved it just one tooth over here, it's going to be a radical shift in the wrong direction of where we set our cam timing. So we're actually going to make the jump to 2 teeth, and you can see that that should give us our 1.5 degrees because that line right there is pretty close to the edge, and this line just basically splits the difference. So we're going to make a movement of 2 teeth on our timing belt to our cam gear. It seems like a step backwards doing this. It's a bit more work, but that's how we get the fidelity to get the fine-tuning adjustment. I tried to get this degreed in without doing it and just moving the dowel pin, and we were basically jumping back and forth on either side of top dead center where we needed to be. So I need to make this fine-tooth adjustment, so hopefully I can split the middle of those and get it right on spec. I'll get everything set up. I'm going to bring you guys back and show you exactly how it needs to be. Show you all those marks so that way it's pretty clear for you, and then we're going to move forward and pull the timing belt back off, move our cam gear, and we're going to have to go through and retension our belt. So let's get to it. Okay, so I set the engine back up, top dead center, cylinder number 1. You can see that I put business cards back into the camshaft so they don't rotate, and you can see that I took a silver Sharpie and I marked my belt. I mark my cam gear, and I like to do it in 2 locations. I also mark the exhaust cam gear because, again, I want to be sure that I have this belt in the exact same location on this gear, and down on my crank drive I have it marked there as well. So once I'm done, is what I'm looking for is I'm looking for this black mark in relation to this gray mark to be 2 teeth off. Now when I make this change, I'm gonna pull my dowel pin out and this bolt out. I'm going to make the change on my timing belt, get it positioned where I want, get some tension back on the belt about where it needs to be, and then I'm just going to put the dowel pin back in whichever hole is closest for it to fit, and then we're going to come back around and start reworking our camshaft timing. So I'm going to work to get this belt and gear moved. I'll retension the belt, get the dowel pin back in, and I'll bring you guys back to run the cam timing after that. I'll get this taken care of. We'll come back and see what we end up with. All right, I got the cam gear swapped over so we can see my original mark here on the timing belt, and we moved it 2 teeth. This was the mark to where it was over here. But before I put my bolt back in, I wanted to show you how we're quite a ways off so you can see where the hole was where we originally were on the camshaft. My dowel pin is now up here, and this is where the dowel pin was on the camshaft gear. So what I did is I pulled the belt, moved the cam gear, left the dowel pin out. I had the cam locked in place, and I slid the dowel pin into the holes that aligned the best. I did have to loosen the cam caps with the business cards and slightly rolled the camshaft up a little bit to get the dowel pin all the way in, but that's where we ended up. You can see that I took all the business cards back out. So I'm gonna get my bolt in so it's tight. That's gonna allow me to rotate the crankshaft. Gonna go back through, reset my tension on my timing belt. I just kind of guesstimated it with my pin right here on the looseness of the pin. We'll use our frequency gauge, get that dialed in, and from there we'll be able to come back and see what effect we had on our camshaft timing. All right, that'll work for our belt tension. So we got our belt tensioned, our pulley on the intake cam moved 2 teeth. So we'll bring this back over and recheck our timing. We're gonna need to rotate this over so we're on top dead center compression, showing 0 on our gauge. So we'll take it over to overlap. We're getting close. Now our valves are starting to open. We're watching our gauge and we're looking for 2.41. 241 there. So we are about 6 degrees after top dead center. So 6 degrees after top dead center is actually a good thing, because if you remember correctly, one movement of the dowel pin on the cam gear and camshaft is 3 degrees. So if we move 2 holes, we should get our 6 degrees and be spot on this camshaft. All right, so we'll bring it back around on this one, and I'm gonna stop it right on the overlap on top dead center. We know we're 6 degrees off. We've made no changes. We'll stop right there. So right now we're at 1.89. We know we want 2.41. We stopped right on our 0 degree mark. We know because we stopped rotating the crank when we achieved the desired lift on the camshaft. That gave us our 6 degrees. Now that we're at 0 degrees top dead center, we know that we basically need more lift by 6 degrees. Meaning I can look at my cam lobe and see that we're measuring the opening of the intake cam, and right now the cam is not open far enough, so we're retarded on our timing. So we need to advance the timing. So I'm going to rotate this camshaft counterclockwise and the dowel pin counterclockwise. That's going to rotate the lobes to start opening the valves more, which is going to push them down and get us closer to that 2.41. Normally I like to move everything 1 hole at a time, but for the sake of things today, mathematically it should work out if I just move it 2 holes in one shot. So we're going to go ahead and get that taken care of now. Now there's one thing that I have not mentioned. Let me grab my wrench. And that's the position of the camshaft when we decide to make this change. We don't necessarily need the engine on top dead center. I can just take this bolt out, move that dowel pin at any point where we're at. However, it is kind of important sometimes to make sure you have the camshaft oriented in a way where you can actually fit your wrench onto a cam lobe. And I have enough room to rotate the camshaft. This actually gets pretty tight with the casting of the head, where I don't have enough room to actually rotate the camshaft. And I've had times where I've pulled the dowel pin out, went to go put the cam on to rotate it, and I didn't have room. Had to put the dowel pin back in, rotate the engine to a point where I can fit the cam on, and use the wrench to move the camshaft, leaving everything else in place. So let me pop out our bolt and our dowel pin here. See if we can, dowel pin slides out without much fuss. And ironically, the hole that we're putting the dowel pin back into was the original hole on the cam gear. And very carefully and slowly rotate the cam while I'm putting pressure on the dowel pin so I can get it to slide into the hole. Right there, it just slid in. So we've made our adjustment. We'll slide our bolt back in and see if we nailed it. I'm hoping we do. All right, starting to get some intake valve opening. Slowing it down, 2.2, 2.3, slow it down, 2.39, 2.4, 2.41. That puts me just maybe 1 1/4 I would say. So if we're 1 1/4, we oh so slightly have too much lift. So we have it now, is what I'm thinking, is I have it stopped here on top dead center overlap. We have 2.54, we're looking for 2.41. I mentioned this earlier, we can loosen our cam gear bolt. I'm gonna pull the cam gear clockwise towards me, and I felt that move a pretty good amount. Tighten down our bolt. Now that is the slop that I was talking about in the dowel pin to the cam and the cam gear. So with that adjusted, we will see what reading we get here. All right, intake valve starting to open. 230. And bring this up 241 right there. And with that movement, that puts me at 1/2 degree off from top dead center. So you can see that I had 1 degree of movement by rotating the camshaft. I mentioned I don't like relying on that, but when I was 1.25 degrees off, if I were to move the dowel pin another hole, that was going to overshoot me by 2 degrees on the other side, and we weren't going to be able to hit our tolerance. So with this on our tolerance, I am comfortable with that where we have everything positioned. And also, one thing that's important to note is the direction of rotation, meaning this timing belt is rotating counterclockwise. And when I went and pulled that camshaft back, I basically loaded everything, and that's the normal place where that dowel pin is going to want to rest on the camshaft, where it's pulling the camshaft. Essentially, the valve train is resisting the camshaft from turning, so that cam gear is going to rotate counterclockwise on the cam will rotate clockwise. So the position that it's in right now, even if that bolt was a little bit loose, it's not going to slide forward. It's actually going to stay in that back position. We'll do a few more cycles through to be sure we get repetitive numbers. If they look good, we're going to shift all of our tooling to the exhaust side and see where we end up on that one. All right, coming around on our 3rd and final time. We're at 1, 2, 1, 5, 1, 6, 1, 7, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're going to really start slowing down here. 2, 3, 6, 2, 3, 9, 2, 4, 1. And we're right on the money. We're really 1/4 to 1/2 degree off. Now, one thing I have not mentioned to this point is you do have to leave a little bit of tension on your wrench. If I release this ratchet a little bit, the tension from the timing belts in the engine, it's going to want to spin backwards a little bit, and you'll see it on the degree wheel. It'll move back 1 degree or 2. So you have to be real careful, because I don't want to move it any further and cause more rotation and more valve lift, but I want to keep it at the same resting point. So right now we're just a little bit past 0 degrees. So to prove the point, I'm going to let off, and you can see that it moved 1/2 degree. It looks like it's slowly creeping a little bit right now. So you have to keep a little bit of tension when you're reading the degree wheel. You can't just let go of the wrench, come around and position yourself. Again, I mentioned this earlier, I'm really picky and OCD on this, and I really like a lot of fidelity and being very, very precise on what I'm doing. And it's just these little small details that I've picked up over the years of doing it is my preferred method. I'm not necessarily saying this is a must-do or the only way to do it. It's just my method that I'm sharing with you guys, and things that I've found that they're variables, and these variables can create inconsistencies and they make things inaccurate, right? And everything we're doing right here is all about accuracy. So those are things I kind of get stuck on sometimes, and I wanted to share them with you. Let's move over to the exhaust. All right, we're all set up on the exhaust side, and we have it on top dead center overlap. We need to zero our gauge out. So, tricky little guy. There you go. So on top dead center overlap, our exhaust valves are open, but they're in the closing state. So I said that on bank 1, meaning we're only measuring the remaining lift of the valve. So the zeroing point of this gauge with this at 0 is critical on this particular step. On the intake side, we were zeroing out this gauge with the cam lobe off of the lifter bucket, so the valve is fully closed, so it wasn't as critical. It's kind of flip-flopped, right? On the intake side, the zeroing of this gauge isn't as critical, but the reading we get as we rotate the crankshaft in relation to which degree we're at is critical. On the exhaust side, it is critical where we zero out this gauge in relation to the crankshaft. However, the rotation of the crankshaft degrees afterwards is not as critical because once we're done, or once that valve and that lifter is done moving, it doesn't matter what crankshaft degree we have until we rotate so far that it starts to open again. It's just important to remember at what points are real critical in what we're doing. Meaning when I rotate this crankshaft on the exhaust side, I'm not really worried about how many degrees I'm cranking it. I'm more so focused on being sure I'm on top dead center overlap and this is calibrated correctly. We're going to rotate our crankshaft, and remember, we're watching the lift remaining in the camshaft, so we're going to see how far this is going to come up when we rotate the engine over and have the exhaust valve close. We're shooting for 2.29 millimeters of travel being left. So we'll rotate this over, and we got 2.35. All right, that's quite close. So we'll keep rotating this over, and let's bring it back to top dead center overlap without touching anything. All right, we're coming up on overlap. So you can see as I'm getting close to overlap, my gauge is moving. That's what I was saying. It's important that we're careful on this part and precise. So I'm watching my degree wheel. I'm going to bring this up to 0. I'm going to stop right there. Right about there. That guy about matches, so we're a little off on this. So we'll re-zero it. So now we're going to rotate this and see if our numbers match up. And 2.38. So again, the same number. We're 0.09 away from our 2.29 that we're targeting. I have a larger number than the number that's specified, meaning I have more valve travel than I should. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to watch this dial gauge as I pass top dead center overlap. And what I'm going to be looking for is I want to see 0.09 millimeters on this gauge, because we know that's the difference from the spec that I have and the spec that I'm seeing on my gauge. That number that I'm going to see on the degree wheel is going to tell me how many degrees out that this is. Of course, we also have the chart in the workshop manual that we can reference, and we will to back up our information. Okay, so we're going to bring it right up to top dead center overlap, and we're zeroed out on our dial gauge. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate the crankshaft so this reads 0.09. Right there, looking at our degree wheel, we're 1 degree off. Now, the way this method works is if I were to zero out this gauge, we went just a little over at 10, but let's zero this gauge out and then rotate this remaining lift, we're almost at it's 2.27. So just by doing a little bit of math, I can use that math with this dial gauge in conjunction with the degree wheel, and I can quickly tell myself how many degrees out my camshaft timing is without needing to go to the book and look at the chart. Now I was ending up with 2.38, so let's go to the workshop manual and I'll see what that tells me on my chart. 2.38, it gives me 2.40 is 17 degrees off, and we're looking for 16 degrees on the exhaust cam. So that chart matches. 2.38 is close enough to 2.4. It says that's 1 degree away from the desired timing angle. On this one, we hit it right on the money. So all of our cams are in spec, our belts are tension, we're good to go, right? Not quite. So I ran you guys through this procedure. I explained it. I got it filmed. Hopefully you're able to follow along and understand it. But the fact of the matter is this customer deserves the best that I can give him. Frankly, when I'm filming and talking to you guys through this, my attention is split. And I want to be able to run through this cam timing with all of my attention and detail and care focused exactly on that. So what I have planned is I'm going to set you guys aside, and I'm basically going to start this procedure all the way over from the scratch. I'm going to confirm my timing belt tensions. I'm going to reestablish top dead center on bank 1. I'm going to run through my cam timing checks on my intake side on bank 1. On the exhaust side, I'll shift everything over. I'm going to do the same on the exhaust side. Again, I'm only going to be doing this so that way I can not be worrying about it, how I'm explaining it to you guys, and I'm going to be 100% focused on the job at hand. I really want to be sure that I give my customer the best that I'm capable of doing. I don't expect that we're going to have anything changing from where we are now. If we do, I'll bring you back. I'll tell you. We'll recap what we end up with after I get this ran through. However, it's late in the day today, so that's going to have to happen tomorrow. All right, as promised, I told you what I'd find after running through the belt tension again and the camshaft timing. Let's start with our belt tension. On bank 1, I actually found that my frequency was a little bit too high. I was kind of in the 230 hertz range, targeting 220. Bank 2, I was dead nuts on 220, which is the top of our spec. So I made some adjustments to the bank 1 timing belt to get that to match. Got that settled, moved into our camshaft timing. Now on our bank 1 camshaft timing, again, both the intake and exhaust were within spec, although I found that they were 1 degree off. However, I was fortunate, I was able to take both camshafts on bank 1 and retard them by keeping my dowel pin in the same position on the cam gear and the camshaft. So I was using just that slack that we talked about, that dowel pin in the cam gear, pulled both of them back to the end stop of that dowel pin. That gave me the 1 degree on both camshafts, so they're now both dialed in perfectly on spec, exactly where we want them. Bank 2, our intake cam, it was still where we left it, no changes needed, it was exactly on spec. And on my exhaust cam over here, same thing, no changes needed. All right, now for reference, when I pulled this apart, I documented my cam timing, and I found that on bank 1, my intake cam was retarded 1 degree, and my exhaust cam was on spec. And over here on bank 2, my intake cam was advanced 1 degree, my exhaust cam was retarded 1 degree. So on this particular engine, it was already dialed in pretty close from the start. Needed a little bit of tweaking on the tail end for me to get everything dialed in exactly where I want it. Keep in mind, Ferrari's tolerance is plus or minus 1 degree on camshaft timing. That's a bit of a spread. That's really a 3 degree spread essentially. And I was able to get these dialed in dead nuts on spec with 1 cam half a degree out, which I'm not going to chase that. That being said, I'm going to drop you guys in, show you the marks on our cam gears before we get this thing all the way buttoned up. Alright, since we didn't make any adjustments on 3 out of the 4 cam gears, our dowel pin is in the same hole on the cam gear as it is into the cam shaft. However, we made quite a bit of adjustments over here on the intake of bank 2, and you can see that my dowel pin is in the original hole of the cam gear, although I'm 1 hole off on the cam shaft, and if you remember, we moved the cam gear 2 teeth on the timing belt. So, this is why I like to have these marked. As you can see, by marking where my cams were when I pulled this apart, saved me a lot of time on 3 of the 4 cams. This also kind of tells me once I'm done where I ended up, and I knew where I started from. I have a good starting point reference. I know where I ended up. Now I mentioned this at the beginning of the video, and this is the precise reason why I do not like people engraving the cam gears, because you can see I ended up changing the cam timing, and if this was all engraved, now those marks would never line back up, and it could confuse the next guy coming along after me. Now that we're all done, I have new O-rings on my bolt. I need to go through and get all the other ones replaced. But more importantly, I need to come through and address my paint marks and my Sharpie. So I use just a paint pen on the cam gear, and since they're pretty oily, that stuff traditionally doesn't stick on there very well. So I take just a pocket screwdriver, a little bit of scraping right there, a little rag, and just like that. My mark is gone, no traces, and I can get my bolt back in. Once the bolt's back in and torqued, I'm going to come through with some acetone, wipe off all these remaining marks I have here, and also the marks I have up top. Leave no traces that I was here. That way, when the next guy comes through, hopefully he'll do the same, make his own marks, and erase them, so that way there's no trace of him being there. Let's get these O-rings replaced and our cams and tensioners torqued down. Take off our marks on the exhaust cam. All right, and our torque spec on our cam gear bolts are 98 Newton meters. So we'll get those snug down for good now. And this is where our cam cards are needed on our camshafts, so that way they don't rotate on me. Give them one more check. So we'll hit our tensioner bearings at 70 Newton meters. back through. Get all our marks off. Now there was existing torque striping on the cam gear bolts, so I'm taking that off as well because we're going to put our own torque stripe on there. Now we can take our business cards off of our cams once and for all. We're done with these guys. Since we're done with the business cards, we're not going to be locking the cams down again. They're out for good. I'm going to go back through and retorque every cam cap one more time. I do this because I want to be sure that I don't accidentally leave a loose cam cap on the engine once I button it up. And I'm probably going to go over it one more time right before I put the valve covers on. But it's just a good practice. You can never be too sure because, you know, we kept having them on and off, tightening them, loosening them. Try to do the same ones each time, but sometimes you lose track. And you need to go back through and just double check. All right, so everything's buttoned up, cleaned up, torque striped, and locked down. Now there's one more thing that I wanted to show you on this, and that is our initial cam assembly marks. Now, we talked about those when we put the camshafts in, those notches that are on the cam caps, and they have corresponding marks on the camshafts. A lot of people feel that those are sufficient to set up your camshaft timing. I can tell you that when you're 1, 2, 3 degrees off, you're really not going to see that very much, and not all cars do those marks line up perfectly with your camshafts. However, on this car, they all line up pretty good, so we can carefully get in there and see my exhaust cam on bank 2. The mark is a little bit to the top side of the notch. I do have the engine on top dead center right now, and this one, again, it's favoring the top side of that notch. It's not quite perfect, and we'll bring you over on the intake side, bank 1. You can barely see, the lighting's not that great, and the exhaust side will be pretty easy. That one's pretty much dead on. So keep in mind, those are your general setup or assembly marks. Those aren't your cam timing marks. They work good as a baseline to get everything back together to a starting point if you didn't mark where everything was. However, don't rely on them solely to set up your camshaft timing. Again, like I said, you have those cams off 2, 3, 4 degrees. You might not see it, or you're going to have a car where those notches, once the cams are degreed, don't line up. That's not unusual. So just keep that in mind when you're going through a belt service on any Ferrari. Okay guys, that was a lot to go through and a lot to explain. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys, I'm a little bit fearful that I didn't do that great of a job of running you through it and explaining it to you, so that way you guys could fully understand it if you're doing this yourself at home. I wanted to come back and kind of give a high-level overview of how I set this up and how I view it in my head. Now we'll just start with the degree wheel. Again, you could use whatever method of a degree wheel you want. I've even seen some people online that are marking their flywheel at the back of the transmission for marking top dead center, although probably not a method I would use. Again, I prefer to have my degree wheel solidly connected to the crankshaft, splined on, not on the center bolt, as big as possible. And my setup was pretty inexpensive and worked great, although I don't think everyone's going to be able to just buy an extra balancer, drill some holes in it, and mount it like I did. However, there's a lot of options, there's many solutions. Pick and choose what's best for you. Now you can see the degree wheel where I put it. I was a bit strategic where I put my top dead center for bank 1 basically in line with bank 1 and top dead center bank 2. I did so because I kind of scanned where I had options to mount my pointers or my coat hanger, and that was the best configuration I had, so that was my strategy on that. You can set it up with one pointer in the center of the valley, set up your top dead center on cylinder 1, and then move your degree wheel 90 degrees and reset it up for bank 2. A little bit more work in my opinion, but it's going to give you the same result. Now I feel that I kind of skipped over this a little bit when I was talking about everything, but our piston travel gauge that we put in our spark plug bore, essentially I'm only using that gauge to calibrate my degree wheel and my pointers to true top dead center of the crankshaft. Once everything's dialed in with that gauge, I leave it in the bore, but I don't really look at it or rely on it. I leave it there because it's good for a spot check to make sure nothing has moved or changed, and I can always just double check and verify that my pointers are calibrated and I didn't bump one and move it. But I'm not using that at any point when I'm watching my dial gauge on the camshaft degree, and I'm relying solely on the digital gauge. And another thing, when I'm calibrating that gauge to my degree wheel, the 0.5 millimeter travel that I'm marking on the gauge and the 8.5 degrees that I'm watching on my degree wheel, those are arbitrary numbers. You can select any number that you want, just make something that's consistent side to side. Essentially is what I'm looking for when I'm doing that, is I want 0.5 degree a millimeter travel on my piston, and that should be 8.5 crankshaft degrees, and I should have that same number on either side before top dead center and after top dead center of the crankshaft. Once that number matches side to side and my needle goes to 0 on my dial gauge at top dead center, where we have that dwell, I know I'm dialed in. Again, it's arbitrary. You can pick anything you want. If you want to drop it down 1 millimeter, you're going to see more degree sweep on your crankshaft. Whatever works for you. So that really gets us to, once we're set up with our digital dial indicator on our lifter bucket, again, fasten or make some kind of rod that has a 90 degree ledge on it so you can get on that lifter bucket and work around the camshaft. That's going to make it wildly easier for you. Spend some time, find a good way to affix that dial gauge to the head where it doesn't move much, because you're going to be recalibrating it or zeroing it out. And if it's a little bit loose, that's going to move. It's going to change your readings. You want to have faith in that gauge and that reading that 0 is 0, or that 2.41 millimeter is 2.41 millimeters. So it really helps to invest a little bit of time, make a fixture, get that locked down solid, get it set up correctly. Now for the camshaft timing. Again, just a quick crash course. This is how my head interprets it. So intake side, outer valve. Don't use a center valve. Get all your tooling set up. You're going to rotate the engine to top dead center compression on that particular cylinder. At top dead center compression, both the intake and exhaust cams are going to be closed, meaning there's no lifter movement on the valves, everything's shut. You're going to zero out your dial indicator on that gauge, and you're going to rotate the engine to top dead center overlap. Now you're going to stop on your degree wheel at the 0 degree mark, and then you're going to read the number on your dial indicator, the digital dial indicator. You should have 2.41 millimeters. Now, if you do not have 2.41 millimeters, you can look in the chart that's in the factory workshop manual, and it tells you what the numbers are in relation to how many degrees off you are. However, I showed you guys how we can rotate the engine over and go through that process, but instead of watching the degree wheel and stopping at top dead center overlap, I watch the dial gauge and I stop at 2.41 millimeters, then look at the degree wheel, and that will instantly show me how many degrees before or after top dead center that camshaft's degreed into. Now for the exhaust side, similar but a little bit different. We're going to have the engine on top dead center overlap. We're going to zero the gauge out on the exhaust valve. Now it's critical that we keep tension on the engine and timing belt because there is valve movement at this point, and the zeroing of this gauge is critical. Now the exhaust valve is on the process of closing at this state, so we're going to rotate the engine over once everything's zeroed. We can rotate it 90 degrees, 100 degrees, 110, basically till the cam lobe is off the lifter bucket and we're on the base circle of the cam. At that point, we're going to read the number that's left on the dial indicator, and it should be 2.29 millimeters. So if we're at 2.35, for example, we're at 6/100 of a millimeter past travel, meaning we could subtract that 6/100 of a millimeter on the camshaft, do our math, stop the degree wheel there, and that will tell us also how far we're out, or we can use the chart. Now, speaking of the chart, I just wanted to give you guys an example. When I set my camshaft timing, I do the math on the degree wheel. I don't reference the chart on how far we're in or out on my degrees. All right, so let's talk about these numbers for a second, because I've mentioned that they're arbitrary numbers. The workshop manual states that the intake camshaft should be 16 degrees advanced and the exhaust camshaft should be 16 degrees retarded. Now, that's where they're establishing these numbers at 2.41 millimeter and 2.29 respectively for the intake and exhaust. Meaning at 16 degrees advanced, I should have 2.41 millimeters of valve movement on the intake, and at 16 degrees retarded on the exhaust cam, 2.29. So going to our chart, 16 degrees is 2.41 millimeters. We have a plus or minus 1 degree range, so at 17 degrees, we should be reading 2.52 millimeters on our digital gauge, or 2.29 millimeters if we're 15 degrees. So that's our plus or minus 1 degree, essentially goes from 2.29 millimeters to 2.52 millimeters. So it's a pretty big range, and I ended up at 2.44. So I can look at that chart and know that I'm like a quarter of a degree off, like I am dialed. And again, I watch it on the degree wheel, and that 0.03 of a millimeter was virtually unnoticeable on the degree wheel. It was dead set, right on the money, right where I wanted it. So it's really the same thing on the exhaust. They have the same chart. 16 degrees is our 2.29 that we wanted, and the 17 is 240, and the 15 degree is 2.17. So it's the same thing where you can look at that chart and you can see your tolerance on your digital gauge, what you should be reading, which correlates to the crankshaft. There's really two ways to go about it. I don't think there's a right or wrong. Just do whichever works best for you and which one is the most understandable for you. Now, like I mentioned, I really hope that I ran through this and didn't lose you guys and you're able to understand and follow it. But don't fret, because the way things are looking, I actually have a few more timing belt services lined up that I'll be doing here in the shop. It will give me another opportunity for the go through, run through this procedure, take another shot at it, explain it to you guys, and hopefully you guys understand it. Now, when I'm building my own engines, particularly if I'm building a domestic V8 or a custom engine or something where I don't have a rigid workshop manual like these that I'm following, I will degree my camshafts in on the intake centerline method. I don't do it on these engines simply because I have to assume that whoever is going to be servicing this car next is going to be following the workshop manual. Meaning, I want to be consistent. I want to set this up and degree these cams in the way the next guy would possibly check them and do them himself. If I just start deviating and degreeing these cams wildly differently and not leaving good documentation or understanding of what I did, the next guy might come across and not understand how I achieved what I did or what I was doing. So I prefer to keep it to the workshop manual. They have their process. It works just fine. It takes a little bit to understand, but I stick to it. That way it's consistent. Someone else can come in after me, follow what's in the workshop manual, and they should find the exact same results that I did when I was finished with the car. As it sits, this car came in with all 4 camshafts basically within that plus or minus 1 degree tolerance. Now they're all dead nuts in, meaning that the camshaft timing on this car will be better when it leaves than it was when it came in, which is always my goal. All right, guys, so we got the heads on, our timing belts are on and tensioned, and our camshafts are degreed in. Everything's buttoned up, locked down, and torque striped. So we are set, ready really to get into the final stretch of the final assembly of this engine. But that's gonna have to wait for the next video. I'm pretty sure that we covered more than enough in today's video. So with that being said, guys, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And like we did in the last video, jump in the comment section. If you got something to say, questions on the cam timing, say that in there. And if you don't have any questions, still jump in the comments. I want to know where you guys are from. So drop the city, state, or country on where you're viewing this video from. For myself, again, Seattle, Washington, Great Pacific Northwest. That's where we're located here. We'll see you guys in the next one, and thank you for watching.